Many bands that are going strong right now also would have been as successful or even bigger in past generations. This video is going to look at 10 bands who would have been successful in past decades. This idea for a video came about when talking to my friend Joe Numbers from Wrestling Soup, which is a great pro wrestling podcast if you're interested. It's smart, hilarious, ridiculous, and always entertaining. Check out the link for Wrestling Soup in the description below. We got to talking, and this is the list of who we think would have killed it in past decades and generations of rock. I'm going to be listing each artist or band in chronological order of when I think they would have done best. Also, this is not to say each band or artist on the list isn't successful right now. They clearly are. Finally, because many people will get confused, once again, this is not a top 10. No true ranking of who's best, just a list. You'll figure this out as we go on. Also, because everyone will try to make this joke in the comments, I'll ruin it for you right now. Ha ha ha, Greta Van Fleet would have worked in the 70s. Ha 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 ha. I saved myself dozens of lame comments by doing that. Okay, let's get to the list. Ghost has been extremely popular and successful over the past decade, taking the metal world by storm with high-selling albums, Grammys, and enormous sellout tours. While metal elitists, the ones who refuse to shower before going out in public, will argue Ghost isn't heavy enough, their music is still metal and accessible to everyone. If you put their sound, especially that of Ghost's most recent works like Raquel in the 70s, I'm convinced Ghost would have been a household name. When Kiss and Black Sabbath were running wild, Ghost could have ran right along with them perfectly in both music quality and gimmick. The overarching story behind all the different papas and Ghost being about a Satanist as a Spirit of Halloween store would have only skyrocketed their popularity back then as well. PTO moms protesting against devil music outside of a Ghost concert? Yeah, Ghost would have been legendary. Ghost are extremely successful right now, and the band has a huge following, but I do think that if Ghost were around in the 70s, they would also have made a huge name selling out arenas like they are now pretty much. But you get what I mean. Ghost would have been a phenomenon back then, especially with Nameless Ghouls and Papa Emeritus killing off disco dancers on stage. It would have been great. For all those posters of Kiss and Black Sabbath hanging in 70s teenager bedrooms, I totally believe that Ghost would have fit in there as well. Also in the 1970s, the British rock style full of swagger and falsetto-y goodness was riding high with bands like Queen, so a group like The Darkness definitely would have fit in. While many people see them as a one-hit wonder, they have much more going for them than one song, and I feel they would have been much more celebrated back in the 70s. The Darkness revel in that classic style of rock with flamboyant charm and making fun music that embodied that era of rock. After the 60s and into the 70s, there was so much fascination for British rock that I think this group would have been enormous and more than known for I Believe in a Thing Called Love. When you look at their discography and track record, The Darkness definitely was in it for the long haul as well. Their following back then in the 70s would have been insane, especially with Justin Hawkins gyrating on stage. The Darkness are underrated, and I think part of that is because they had a style which was not focused on in the mid-2000s when they broke through, and in many ways, The Darkness is inspired by that style in the 70s, but they proved they could keep doing it for many years and it wasn't just trying to cash in on something. That's why I feel they would have stood out also back then in the 70s. The Darkness embody a bygone era and had the music skill, attitude, and presentation to fit right in with big names in the 70s. I believe in an idea like that. For the final entry in the 1970s, I honestly think that as big of a deal Muse has been over the past 20 years, they would have been just as successful if they started in the 70s. When you look at the band's rock style that would eventually dive deep into electronic territory, I think that would have fit perfect with the prog and creative styles flourishing by the end of that decade. Think about other bands going wild with creativity in that generation like Pink Floyd and early Rush. Albums would be distinctly different but still tied to the band's high level of performance. That's Muse to the letter. Match that with wild live performances, and I think Muse would have been another phenomenon like Pink Floyd or Rush in that sense during the time frame. Regardless of whether you prefer the last few Muse albums, I still think they would have fit well with their branching into the electronic style. 70s rock and prog fans would have eaten this up. Except Simulation Theory, which was a tribute to the 80s, which as time went on, that would have just been what everyone else was doing if they started in the 70s and worked up to that. Well, maybe that just fit in perfectly and they would have loved it. I really don't know. Muse checks all the boxes of what takes a great band to the next level and add that factor of always trying to make something different as time goes on. I think that would have appealed big in the late 70s and into the early 80s. Going into the early 80s, the turn of that decade was leading into something big for the true lifestyle of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. For the last 10 years, Halestorm has done a great job with giving off the no frills, no backtracks, straight rock, with plenty of sex appeal and living life fast and loud. Lzzy Hale not only is a true identity of that, but Halestorm's music would have worked in the 1980s because of it. Halestorm has earned its fan base now, and Lzzy is an icon to women everywhere, but in the early 1980s, Lzzy would have been an obsession for everyone in the rock world. Her brother RJ and her are exceptional musicians, so they actually have the chops to back up that attitude on stage and in person. When Van Halen, Def Leppard, and Joan Jett were lighting things on fire in the rock scene, Halestorm's music definitely would have captivated many people along with them in that time frame. Songs like Love Bites and I Am the Fire worked great over the past 10 years, but they would have killed in the early 80s, with Lzzy Hale fronting a band like this and playing that hard while being a figurehead of rock. I think in that time frame, Halestorm would have easily sold like crazy, and all those crazy 80s rock bands would have begged Halestorm to come on the road with them. Halestorm's style continues strong because they don't rely on gimmicks, but rather just living in the moment. Fans in the early 80s would have loved that. Going into heavier territory, the mid-80s truly saw the popularity of heavy metal explode and come to the forefront of the world. The Sword represented metal, but while not in the thrash style of the Big Four or the British royalty like Judas Priest or Iron Maiden, the stoner metal vibe that the Sword had would have been instantly popular with metal fans looking for something different in the mid-80s. When you hear bass and drum work from the Sword, you realize it's not these lightning-fast precision drum rolls, but a loose, flow-based rhythm that added to the experience of each song. Their first few albums, Age of Winters and Gods of the Earth, would have been a big deal in that time frame and added another level of creativity and style when big names in metal were exploding. Even the aesthetic and a name like the Sword fits. It's that perfect name made to be on a patch on the back of a dirty jean vest. The Sword are criminally underrated, and while the band is respected, I think they definitely could have benefited by playing in front of massive crowds in the middle and late 80s around the world. The songs about Norse mythology, Lovecraft, dragons, I mean, this is a perfect cross between fantasy and stoners. Metal fans would have loved some of that in the 80s. The Sword are an amazing band that represent a groove and live feeling that isn't always represented in metal. I think that the Sword was born in the wrong generation. The king of the party has been living the rock style and promoting the power of positivity in music for over 20 years. Needless to say, he represents a bygone era of rock, which really leads me to believe that Andrew WK would have been a huge name in the 80s during the hair metal days. Even if his sound and style aren't hair metal, his gimmick and music still would have fit right in during the 80s. Think about Andrew WK opening up huge shows for Rad or even Motley Crue, and even while doing music later on, he could have been one of the hosts on Headbangers Ball years later. He would have been an idol in the 80s when you look at everything he's already done since the early 2000s and put that back in the past. The clothes, the hair, the attitude, the love for pizza, it's all timeless. But let's be honest, this style of music with this party animal would have connected perfectly when everyone wanted to get wild in the late 80s. I've loved Andrew WK since I saw him way back in high school, and even then in 2003, I knew he was something more than just his music. So having him be the man to play along with other wild bands in the 80s and represent the rock scene in other ways would have been perfect. The 1980s were a time to party hard. Andrew WK knows what to do when it's time to party. It makes sense that he would have been a party rock royalty back in the mid-80s. Jumping into the early 90s, when Nirvana and grunge started taking over and leading the way from the alternative field, a band like Spanish Love Songs would have captivated many people with their bleak writing about life. I mean, grunge reveled in self-loathing, and Spanish Love Songs are masters in that field, along with writing some amazing music. Spanish Love Songs currently dominate with their style of "The World is on Fire," "I Am Suffering in My Life," but it won't get better if I don't do something type of attitude. That would have been massive in the early 90s. Dylan Slocum's voice and sound of the great riffs and bass of the band's music would have exploded in that generation. Think about the lyric writing from bands like Alice in Chains and Soundgarden. Then think of Spanish love songs, misery, self-destruction, being a loser. I mean, that's what the 90s rock scene valued the most. They would have totally fit in.
I love Spanish love songs and want a world of success for them right now. But when I think about the band and the music they create, I really feel they would have been a huge name in the early 90s. Even if their style isn't truly grunge, I think Spanish love songs would have been extremely popular with the same audience.
Two things should happen for Spanish love songs. More people find out about their music and fall in love with it now, or they find a time machine and make use of the early 90s angst. Frank Turner's combination of folk and punk rock has been an inspiration for millions and captivated many listeners over the past 10 years or so. As successful as he has been, I feel Frank Turner and the Sleeping Souls would have been enormous in the 90s when the alternative scene blew up and every type of band was being formed. His lyric writing, fueled with pessimism and internal struggling, matched with upbeat music and impossibly catchy lyrics, would have been the bread and butter of every alternative fan around 1995. Especially after the surge of grunge was winding down, his music would have hit the spot for many people who wanted a different sound but still had plenty of attitude behind it all. And let's be honest, the British charm would have won many people over. The accent always wins people over in the US, there's no denying it.
Whether it's him as a solo act or with the Sleeping Souls, I feel Frank Turner's style would have been another spice of variety in the mid-90s that people would have went insane for. Think of all the other outlier bands that became huge, like Blues Traveler or Bare Naked Ladies. Frank Turner is a big name now, but if he would have been a part of the 90s, I think he would have exploded in popularity worldwide.
A negative man with positive songs that revel in admitting everything is awful, but it can get better. That sounds like 90s angst to me. Alongside Frank Turner in the mid-90s, the Gaslight Anthem would have been a great band at the tail end of the grunge scene who helped launch the alternative style and turn it on its head with amazing hooks and introspective lyrics. Their faster and slower styles would have been a massive mainstream hit for a lot of music fans in general. The Gaslight Anthem could have been a perfect touring companion for openers like Counting Crows or Goo Goo Dolls in the mid to late 90s. Keep in mind that in the 90s, word of mouth and album sales were at an all-time high for any group, so the Gaslight Anthem could have easily earned a platinum album or two. And going back to them opening for big bands, think about the Gaslight Anthem playing Get Hurt to open for Hootie and the Blowfish, who would then later play Let Her Cry. Grown men would be bawling their eyes out in concert venues everywhere.
The Gaslight Anthem's cross between punk and folk rock would have been perfect if the group had made their first big hit in the mid-90s, and it would have carried them for a long time. That ability to capture everyone in each song is something few bands have, and they could either pump you up or make you a sad mess. They would have flourished in the 90s.
The unique style of Jersey's The Gaslight Anthem would have hit home for many people in 1995 and onward. Let's be honest, the alternative scene back then thrived on being bitter while listening to some big hooks. Gaslight Anthem totally had that down.
Before we get to the last entry, please hit the like button below if you've been enjoying this video so far. It helps a ton to get this video pushed in the YouTube search algorithm, proving people like this video and the non-subscribers may like it also. Thank you. Alright, time for a controversial pick, but I can explain it.
Whether you like Machine Gun Kelly or not, after Tickets to My Downfall came out and he ventured into pop-punk after being shooed away from hip-hop, there is no doubt in my mind that Machine Gun Kelly, as a pop-punk performer, would have been enormous in the 2000s, especially in the early and mid-2000s. Really think about it. From 2000 to 2005, pop-punk bands, both great and awful, were huge. If a band like Simple Plan could have gotten big back then, Machine Gun Kelly would have dominated. His vocal ability? Doesn't matter. He's singing about how pathetic he is, and that was all you needed in the early 2000s pop-punk scene to make it huge. Match that with his look and name, and he tries to rap, he would have been playing every 20 minutes on MTV, guaranteed. Add any association with Blink-182, and Machine Gun Kelly would have been a hero to middle schoolers everywhere.
Think of Machine Gun Kelly diving headfirst into pop-punk and listen to his self-deprecating lyrics and whining about nothing? Even if his singing is lousy, the music and production behind him was good, which means it would have been enormous in the early 2000s. By 2005, Machine Gun Kelly would have been unstoppable, like him or not. Machine Gun Kelly would have excelled in the 2000s with every miserable teenager treating him like a music messiah. Scary to think about, but true.
Machine Gun Kelly keeps trying new styles and genres to make his name. The issue may not be what he's making, but that he wasn't old enough 20 years ago to cash in on what he has now. And that was a look at 10 artists and bands that would have succeeded in past generations. Know of another band or artist that would have worked in an earlier era? Leave a comment and let everyone know. Big thanks to my patrons and a special thanks to Brandon Barenfeld, Chris Doman, McKenna White, and Dom Smith. You can have a say in upcoming videos and see them early by supporting Rocked on Patreon. Please click the link in the video description for more info. Please subscribe to get notified on upcoming videos. You can check out my concert photography on Instagram, and you can keep up to date with Rocked on Facebook and Twitter.